of the deaf in developing an arts-based English literacy program, specifically reading and writing. The title of this talk is From the Void to the Voice. This lecture will cover more than 15 years of my teaching journey. What am I doing here? I want to start by providing a bit of a backdrop to what was happening in the province of Saskatchewan in the education of deaf and hard of hearing students. The ministry's primary emphasis was on the development of deaf and hard of hearing students' oral skills. They funded technologies such as cochlear implants and FM systems. Their attitude was that teaching students sign language was a last resort. If the student couldn't succeed orally after several years of instruction, only then would they be introduced to sign language. School boards, on paper, supported both ASL and oral programming, but this quote support did not mean each program had equal resources. By far, the majority of resources were dedicated to oral programming. The group involved in this research were deaf and hard of hearing students between the ages of 14 to 18, some of who were fluent signers, some who only spoke. I was the only deaf teacher of the deaf in the entire province of Saskatchewan who was fluent in ASL. My PhD research focus was language and literacy education. For 5 years, my focus was on developing an arts-based literacy skills program, including American Sign Language skills. I hired 2 artists in residence, Christine Els came to us with a wide breadth of talent and experience in many forms of art creation, visual arts such as painting and drawing, film. She's been involved in a number of different film productions. Theater, including directing, computer graphic arts, just to mention a few of her skills. Oh, let's not forget puppetry. She is a master of the puppets. The other artist was Bernie High. His specialties are photography, filmmaking, as well as being a performer himself. The 2 of them worked closely with me for 5 years developing the arts-based language and literacy program. We called it CRAE, C-R-A-E, Culturally Responsive Arts Education. Before I carry on, full disclosure, I have to make some confessions. Yes, I am deaf, and by that time, I had been interacting with the deaf community for more than 20 years. During those years, I continued to hold the autistic views that deaf students are low achievers. I was stuck in that old pedagogical model. I had worked with countless students who all struggled with understanding English. I sometimes taught individual students, other times I have taught English language arts in the classroom. I also taught social studies, Indigenous studies, psychology, all of which require developing advanced English skills and advanced concepts. I would work hard to pull the weakest students through their high school studies to see them graduate. I couldn't help shake the sense that this tutoring model for supporting these kids was just not working. There are two primary reasons the model was not working. The first reason was my own attitude. I perceived the students as inferior, even though I am deaf myself. I saw myself as superior. After all, I had graduated from university. My English is flawless. Why do the students struggle so? Where was this attitude coming from? Without question, my training as a teacher of the deaf. The emphasis is so heavily geared towards the problems of the deaf and hard of hearing learner, their struggles with English, their emotional baggage, and I was still inculcated into the model I was taught to buy into. The second reason was I didn't feel I had the necessary skills to teach them. I can sign fluently. I completed my training at Gallaudet University. But when high school age students are coming into my classroom with grade 2 reading skills, I was at a loss, a complete loss. I didn't have the necessary skills to work with students at this level. This lack of literacy. I was feeling angry, scared. I felt so stuck, trapped. What could I possibly do with these students? The amount of work and pressure put on me in this situation was depressing. My escape was into a PhD program. I should mention that Christine and I had just been friends up until I started my PhD. I had started my own art practice, and she had been supportive of me. Through our conversations, we had concluded that it was time for me to do something different. Before I go on, I think I should explain further where my low expectations for the students originated. Most teachers of the deaf, as well as professionals that work with deaf and hard of hearing children, assume the ability to acquire language is an innate ability for the child. So if the child is not acquiring language, then there is something wrong with the child. The child is not smart enough. Especially if the investment of cochlear implants, other technologies, and intensive speech training doesn't result in spoken language by the time the child is 7 or 8 years old, then sign language can be introduced. If the child fails to develop, then sign language can be used for communication because clearly the child isn't smart enough to acquire language. For these children, there is intense shame in learning sign language. Using sign language means the child is a failure. The real consequence is that the child, by this time, is language deprived. All these years, they have received little or no exposure to true language. All those early, developmentally important years for language acquisition have been lost, permanently lost. Introducing a first language at the age of 7 is too late. And language deprivation can look like intellectual disabilities. It will have a negative impact on many areas of academic achievement. My PhD coursework was very broad. I was looking at hearing oppression. There are many kinds of isms: racism, classism, sexism, homophobia. Many groups of people experience marginalization. So during my studies, I was being exposed to scholarship around deficit thinking, how we dialogue about this. I started to notice how other teachers spoke about students when they were in the staff room. That kid is just stupid. That kid has an awful family life. That kid has emotional problems. Such negativity is hard to shake off before you go back into the classroom. It's pretty much impossible to unhear what was said about the students in these contexts. Hearing the discourse used by others further reinforced the deficit lens I had been trained to look through. It was very hard to let that go. My PhD studies opened my eyes to recognize how my behaviors were exactly the same. I want to talk about the students I worked closely with for those 5 years. There were 6 of them. One was Indigenous, whose home was a First Nation far north of us. One was Métis. One was an immigrant, recently relocated to Canada. 2 hard of hearing students coded with an intellectual disability. 1 profoundly deaf student coded with an intellectual disability. 5 of the 6 students were evaluated at an English reading level of kindergarten to grade 2.5. The question was what to do with the students. 6 of them truly struggled with reading and writing. I started to look at culturally responsive pedagogy. In culturally responsive pedagogy, the teacher fully embraces the cultures and languages of the students. The students are accepted as the beings they are. The teacher comes with high expectations for their academic performance. A positive environment must be created which is fully accepting of their flaws, skills, and potential. This approach changed my pedagogical frame away from the deficit model. The next framework I began to look at was critical literacies. This is where we take a serious look at the discourse around deaf education. What is the discourse out there about the deaf community, deaf students? After that, I looked at the concept of multiple literacies. This is where the instructor explores different kinds of literacies. For example, visual literacy, financial literacy, mathematical literacy, and so on. This includes multimodal literacies, where various modalities can be incorporated into the teaching, such as touch, smell, taste, movement, reading, writing, auditory, visual. These all stimulate the brain and are all bundled under the framework of multiple literacies. Naturally, I was quite interested to explore the visible literacies theoretical framework. The final framework that I studied was bilingual education. I looked at the research for both hearing and deaf students. While I was doing my PhD studies, I began to wonder how a culturally responsive arts education program might help students to improve their literacy skills, help teach the curriculum, while at the same time lift the students up and change the discourse around how the students were viewed through a disability deficit lens. Was there a way to do this? I gave it a lot of thought. So now I want to talk more specifically about culturally responsive education. The primary focus is lifting the students up by honoring their home and school languages and cultures, to increase their cultural and social well-being and self-esteem. Give them the opportunity to culturally critique the worlds they belong to. Give them space to learn about and critique the deaf community and American Sign Language and explore what it means to them. In my studies, I also learned about culturally responsive arts education. This involves 6 pedagogies. First, arts production, creating art, whatever form it might take: visual arts, drama, weaving, music, the full gamut of arts creation. Number 2, arts integration, how arts is used to teach subjects: English, social studies, psychology, and so on. This is the area I am especially interested in. Aesthetics. This deals with the quality of the piece, demonstrates artistic talent, and has meaning. What does the piece mean? What does it reveal about the deaf community or culture? Number 4, contextual teaching and learning, where the instructor uses conveniently accessible contexts to teach content, avoiding abstract scenarios which have no connection to the learner's lived experiences. Number 5, critical pedagogy, which guides the deaf student to develop self-esteem, accept who they are with pride, and reject the limitations put on them by others. It encourages the deaf students to teach others about themselves, how to advocate for themselves so that others know the responsibility, for example, for accommodations is the hearing person's, not the deaf person's. Number 6, multicultural education. For deaf education, this means bilingual or dual language programming in English and ASL. But it also includes incorporating other cultures, for example, Indigenous ways of knowing, or the cultures of immigrated students. Let's explore what prerequisite skills and conditions are necessary to offer culturally responsive arts in education for the deaf classroom. First and foremost, the instructor must have an academic understanding of the linguistic structure of ASL. Secondly, there must be a solid relationship with the deaf community. The deaf community is an important partner and key to the success of the program. Thirdly, there must be connections with community artists who would be willing to learn ASL and are open to learn a new culture and worldview. I talked to Christine about this not long ago. She said it was very difficult for her to learn sign language. She learned a ton, but as a hearing person, it was more challenging to be immersed in a deaf environment than she thought it would be. Regardless, these 3 elements are foundational to a successful program. Aesthetics. It was important to me that we create quality artistic products so they can be shared with the hearing world as well as the deaf world. I emphasized to our 2 artists in residence that I wanted us to create art to show the world, not art that would then be tossed into the garbage. For me, it was important to show others. I actually knew both artists in residence before starting my focus on culturally responsive arts education programming. I was involved in a play which was written by Christine called Kaleidocycle. It was based on her own experience having had a number of seizures which left her unable to speak or use English. She knew some sign language, but was then forced to use it more deliberately because her brain was not able to use English in the same way. So she started to explore this experience. Eventually, her speech came back to her, but for a period of time, she was limited to what knowledge she had of sign language. Anyway, I was involved in that performance and knew that Christine would come to our arts education program with an advanced understanding of living with communication barriers. I was able to establish a solid rapport with the 2 artists in residence. We had productive discussions about the deaf community's issues, challenges, and opportunities. They were both very enthusiastic about their involvement in the program for those 5 years. The 3 of us researched ASL literature, ASL performing arts, visual arts by deaf artists. Unfortunately, there were no deaf artists available in Regina or Saskatchewan, for that matter, who could come into our program, though we did look for one to act as a model for the students in their own art practice. I was able to establish a solid rapport with the 2 artists in residence. We had productive discussions about the deaf community's issues, challenges, and opportunities. They were both very enthusiastic about their involvement in the program for those 5 years. The 3 of us researched ASL literature, ASL performing arts, visual arts by deaf artists. Unfortunately, there were no deaf artists available in Regina or Saskatchewan, for that matter, who could come into our program, though we did look for one to act as a model for the students in their own art practice. Now I want to move the discussion to arts integration. I integrated drama and arts activities into our English class. I also integrated the arts into our ASL class. I did a number of project-based activities to guide the learning. We, the whole class, developed the play Deaf Crows, which I'll explain in more detail later. I incorporated the study of various genres of storytelling, such as folk tales, fairy tales, etc. We would transform these stories to reflect the deaf experience by incorporating visual storytelling techniques, filming, and ASL storytelling too. We worked with a number of non-deaf artists from the local community. We went on field trips to live performances that were being interpreted. I developed a significant repertoire of teacher assessments which analyzed the progress of students' multimodal literacy skills. I used these assessments for every project done throughout the development of Deaf Crows. I applied the framework of multicultural education, actually, in our case, bicultural education, meaning A sound in English, and added the additional concept of deaf space into our culture. I encouraged the students to create their own deaf space. I wanted to let them figure out where the best place to sit was, how the desks and furniture should be placed in the room, where I should stand. It was up to them to create the space to serve deaf needs. They were responsible to take care of the space, keep it clean. They had to move furniture around as needed for the activities they were doing. They were also responsible for taking care of and organizing all the art supplies. No matter where we are, deaf people claim their space. It is always in the midst of hearing space, but deaf people do claim their space, whether in the middle of the street, in the middle of a shopping mall, or in a crowded coffee shop. We create our own space. So how does one start? It can be a bit of a schmoz. First, you have to build community. Remember that all the students come from different places, and the diversity in the communication skills, whether English or American Sign Language, is wide, which is a challenge. So we started to build community by creating a shared deaf artists space. We made this huge painting, collected paint from a number of different stores, all kinds of colors. And we just threw the paint all over the canvas. It was certainly a messy activity, but went a long way towards building community. The painting itself was too large to try and mount, so it was cut up into sections and each student was given the piece they liked. It was a key reminder of the importance of the painting experience. After the mammoth group painting exercise, where we got cans of paint and threw it onto the canvas, I had them do a poster project. It had to be about their deaf experience. We had discussions about the content and context of their lived experience. We discussed what they felt was prioritized, emphasized in their lives. Was it hearing or vision? Unanimously, they agreed that others emphasized the value of hearing most. So we explored that further. I asked them, what are you able to understand in your world through your hearing? What are you able to understand in your world through your vision? You could see the students begin to realize that learning through vision is possible. Many students would recount stories of conflicts with their audiologists or parents who insist that the students not lip read to understand what's being said. They were only supposed to use their hearing. Students would share how the audiologist would tell them that they failed their hearing test. Yet none of the students failed their vision test. So, for their poster project, they came up with the following statement: the sweet moment when eyes are equal to the ears. This was a profound bonding moment. The poster assignment led to a deep discussion about feelings of failure. Because they had to accept sign language as part of their life, we discussed their experiences around communication through hearing versus seeing. We encouraged self-reflection about what it was like to focus on what they were actually seeing, to learn how to see, and to value what they see. We spent a lot of time comparing and contrasting the deaf experience in the deaf world and the hearing world, the hearing and deaf cultures, languages, beliefs, customs, traditions. The students began to understand that in deaf culture, vision is paramount. I was moved by the artwork created by one student. They went home and created 2 paintings, including the one you see here of a blackbird in a cave. They brought the picture to me the next day, and I asked them, "What is the bird doing?" They replied, "Waiting." And I asked, "Waiting for what?" "Waiting for someone to lead it out of the cave." And the other students chimed in and said, "Exactly, that's exactly what we feel." The students decided to use the bird metaphor to develop it and explore the metaphor as a reflection of their lived experience as deaf youth. It became a group metaphor for the deaf experience. We went deeper and deeper into our analysis of the deaf and hearing worlds. I noticed a shift in the students. As a group, they were becoming more and more aware of power imbalances. For example, the 2 hearing people in the room would assume control. Our classroom had 2 hearing interpreters, as well as an assortment of deaf and hard of hearing students, both oral and signing students. The students began to notice that being able to speak and hear was considered superior, and sign language was inferior. So I capitalized on these observations and experiences to discuss the concepts of audiocentric privilege, autism, and the auditory industrial complexes, the equipment and service providers that profit from perpetuating the oral approach. The students began to understand the discourse and how the discourse feeds, reinforces, and maintains the power for hearing people. You'll remember I told you about the student who drew the picture of the blackbird. Now I want to tell you about the second piece they brought to the class. We had been discussing the idea of language deprivation and exploring what that really means. I asked the students to reflect on their own life experiences and consider the concept of language deprivation. Several of the students were brought to tears and became upset. They realized that their struggles to learn had nothing to do with their mental capacity, some of whom had been labeled as mentally challenged, but instead their struggles were a result of actually being deprived of language, which led to cognitive delays. So then the discussion moved on to questions about whether brain function can improve after experiencing language deprivation. I told them I didn't know. I said I'd like to try by integrating ASL and the arts into the classroom. It was after these discussions that the student returned to the classroom with a new drawing of the bird. The skin and feathers over the bird's skull were pulled back so the brain could be seen from the side, and how the breaks in connections in the brain caused by language deprivation were sewn together to be reconnected. We moved on to explore the historical oppression of deaf students leading to language deprivation. We watched a number of videos of deaf adults sharing their experiences growing up. We learned about the oppression of the deaf community and culture, and the suppression of deaf literature and deaf culture within the K 12 curriculum. The students came to the realization that their difficulties were due to language deprivation, not because they were badly behaved, stupid, or any other reason. So it meant we had to work together to create those connections in the brain, which might be accomplished through art. We began to think about creating a play called Deaf Crows. After months of research and discussion about crows, we decided to make masks. We didn't know if they would be used in the play, but we decided to make masks. So many of our activities came organically, and we had no idea where they would lead. That's something I need to warn you about. Once you embark in arts integration pedagogy, you won't always know where it's leading you. So the students made their masks, and much later, we determined how they could be incorporated into the play. At the same time, we focused on developing skills necessary to create art. For example, drawing techniques, painting techniques, color mixing, and art techniques. We studied different styles of art, for example, Impressionism. We surveyed the various eras in art history. We created pieces representing Expressionism, abstract art, 3D art, visual storytelling, ASL poetry, and puppetry. We made creative videos, including editing them. We studied puppet making, mime, physical theater, script writing. Yes, indeed, we did all that. I don't know how we did it, but we did. So that gives you an idea of what we were doing while we were exploring the deaf experience, metaphor, and deaf crows. We just plowed ahead in creating art and developing artistic skills while exploring those topics. One method of focus was 2D art. This is where I taught art theory, technique, color mixing, drawing, and so on. The students were learning to see. As deaf people, we use our vision to be sure, but they needed to learn how to see, which is a different skill altogether. We also studied the different eras of art history. For example, the medieval time period is known for illuminated manuscripts, which were elaborately decorated. So the students had to do a writing project reflecting that period. No matter what we did, the students had to do a written piece about their art. During the unit on 2D art, where we discussed art history and techniques, for each art project the students were working on, they also had to create an English story. We made an abstract art comic book incorporating color field and visual storytelling techniques, and illustrated the plot of the story called The Handless Maiden, which is about a young woman. Another example of a 2D art project was exploring the concept of archetypes. The idea that inside all of us we have many different archetypes or characters. For example, the lover, the magician, the wise woman, the wise man, the warrior, the healer, and so on. So I asked the students to create an abstract painting, and then they had to tear it into pieces. After that, they had to reconstruct it using glue. That was a difficult exercise. They reached a point where they were satisfied with the final product, but they were heartbroken to tear up their work. With encouragement, they did it, but it was a challenge. Another 2D art project was focusing on visual storytelling techniques. We explored how to use line, shape, tone, color, etc., to fit within or reflect the plot. So the students had to analyze the story Bluebeard and determine how to align the visuals, such as the lines, their placement, the angle, the length, etc., how they could be incorporated into the art to reflect the plot points and the arc of the story. We did a 3D project as well. The students were tasked to create a dream box and to add items to it that represent their dreams. They had to picture themselves, expose their feelings, and embark on a hero's journey. In English, we were studying archetypes and specifically the hero's journey. The parallel project for each of the students was to represent their personal hero's journey in the dream box. Once they created their dream box, then we filmed it. That video served as a backdrop while the students each presented in ASL their project and what dreams the items in the box represented. We used video in a number of different ways. We created shadow puppets and wrote a script for a simple action movie. Then, with all our props and supplies, the entire class went to a real movie studio and we produced the film together. Our final project was to put all this work we had done together and create a play. It included the masks, students' personal stories of growing up deaf, puppets, projections, ASL poetry, and so on. All the elements combined to create the Deaf Crows. We took the performance to a professional theater house. We decided we would not perform in the school. We didn't want our work linked to the school or considered a school-based project. We wanted it out there for the whole community to see, and that's what we did. The Deaf Crows production has 6 stories, one segment for each student. As they performed their individual experiences, the other students served as supporting characters for the main student's storytelling. One character I'm featuring here is named Blood. Blood tells a heart-wrenching story of the oppression she experienced. This is her story that she decided to share. Each student made their own mask to represent their individual crow.
Once upon a time, on a vast prairie, there was a great tree. As it was the only tree for many miles, birds came from all directions to roost in the tree, tell bird stories and bird jokes, to play bird games, and to share bird lore with each other. A woodsman saw it and decided to chop the tree down. The birds themselves forgot who they were. They forgot how to fly, and they forgot the soaring heights of the sky. They forgot what their wings were for. In short, they forgot how to be birds.
The mother and her deaf son have an appointment with the audiologist. The audiologist tells the mother that the son's hearing is stable. That means he'll be able to speak more and hear more. But the mother says he only speaks 50 words and he is 7 years old. The audiologist is emphatic. I've been telling you for 7 years, if he learns to sign, he'll be relegated to the small world of the deaf. He must learn to speak to function in the hearing world. But the mother complains, I am frustrated. He can't understand me and I can't understand him. Maybe it's time we learn sign language. The audiologist interrupts. No, just keep up the hard work. It will pay off with employment in his future.
Congratulations on graduating.
This is wonderful. Thank you. One day, this book will be yours, but for now,
Thank you. But wait. You're welcome. Now go away.
in Deaf Crows, one of the stories is about bullying. It's pretty emotional. All the masks made by the students were representing their personal inner feelings. Deaf Crows featured a narrator, a wise deaf elder. He appears in each of the Deaf Crows stories and bestows upon them some gift, something connected to deaf culture, and teaches each of them something in sign language. Parents, teachers, sign language students, everyone in the audience was moved by the show. No one in the audience expected the performance to be of such high quality. The student stories were moving and so well done. So this meant we couldn't stop now. We had to keep the momentum going. We decided to set up a nonprofit organization called Deaf Crows Collective. We did this in 2016. The collective brings deaf and non-deaf performance together to do shows on the deaf experience as well as other plays. Our second performance was called Nay's Story. This is his name sign. That production uses puppets and projection. It's a story about a deaf man from Burma.
She's talking about Nay's story.
Who lived in the jungle for 7 years, found a refugee camp and lived there for 10 years before finally moving to Regina. The play is about the man's life before he moved to Canada, many of the profound hardships he had to go through, as well as his uniquely deaf experience. This piece was performed at the Saskatchewan Arts Awards celebration in 2016. Remember, during this entire time, we were still doing all the other school studies and tasks. The school program and the Deaf Crows Collective were closely linked. Next, we organized an arts installation called the Deaf Forest. The Deaf Forest was installed at a professional art gallery in the downtown Regina library. The installation had 3 areas. You'll remember the discussion previously about deaf space? Well, this installation was really defining space, hearing space, hard of hearing space, and deaf space. But the space metaphor was a forest, hearing forest, hard of hearing forest, and the deaf forest. The hearing forest used visual storytelling techniques using shape and line. It's not a friendly space. Deaf people don't experience the hearing world as friendly. So all the lines in the forest trees came across as sharp and harsh. It was done in black and white with no color. Tones were darker. This was entirely designed by the students. The hard of hearing forest, also designed by the students, was meant to feel like a creepy forest. Strips of fabric hung down from above, and one had to push them aside in order to get through it. There were two walls opposite each other where text was written. Lines taken from creepy fairy tales. Except some of the text was covered up. As a metaphor for being unable to hear everything people say. The walls
Done back. Do this again. Oh.
The last world is the hard of hearing forest, also designed by the students, was meant to feel like a creepy forest. Strips of fabric hung down from above, and one had to push them aside in order to get through it. There were two walls opposite each other where text was written. Lines taken from creepy fairy tales. Except some of the text was covered up. As a metaphor for being unable to hear everything people say. The walls also represent how hard of hearing people are stuck between two worlds. The last world is the deaf world, the deaf forest. It was represented by a huge fabric tree. A lot of sewing labor went into it. Many different kinds of fabrics were used, many different colors. Pretty, colorful flowers were placed all over the tree. We partnered up with a deaf elementary program, and the children drew finger spelling alphabet hand shapes, which were hung on the tree. Finally, to carry through the metaphor of the black deaf crow, a large, colorful bird was perched in the tree, free to enjoy the forest. Next, we developed another play called Apple Time. Again, we performed this in a local professional theater space. Artisan Theater, which is a small venue. The Premier Theater in Regina, the Globe Theater, heard about our production and asked us to stage it with them, which was quite an honor. In addition, we also performed at the Deaf Arts Festival Sound Off in Edmonton. The play Apple Time is a conceptual journey where the characters are traveling to Apple Time. But is it a place? Is it a process? Is it a journey? The destination is the deaf community. Apple Time was quite different because it was addressing the complexities of intersectionality between deaf culture, multiple identities, and languages. At this point, a number of new students had joined the school program, and several of them were new immigrants. These students were learning ASL and learning English at the same time. Apple Time was an assemblage of hearing and deaf people, some who knew sign language, some who didn't, some who spoke, some who didn't. where there were lots of different languages and identities, creating a rhizomatic space. Appletime aims to make you think about the meaning of diversity and how to care for and support one another. Looking back over those 5 years, I really considered what I had found, what had changed. The first profound change was that all of the students were much more engaged in reading. In the beginning, they were totally reluctant readers, not interested in trying, and would avoid it at any cost. By the end of the 5 years, they were readers, seeking out books to read, and they would have engaging discussions about books. The students became more analytical, whether it was attention to detail in the art or decoding text. They would focus on details in a way they hadn't before. All the students had grasped the concept of metaphor. With a previous group of deaf and hard of hearing students, with a reading level of grade 5, I had tried to teach the concept of metaphor, and they never really understood, though they tried. However, by the end of the 5 years, this group skillfully could identify metaphoric language when presented to them. They were now able to identify how often it comes up in their environment. In the beginning, they were rigid in their thinking, unable to problem solve in some instances. But through the art activities, their thinking became more flexible. They were able to identify multiple options for solving problems. Their reading skills noticeably improved. They were able to break through that plateau they had been previously stuck at. I would say that they were reading at 2 or 3 grades higher. Their writing skills noticeably improved. Both grammar and structure improves so that their writing was easily understandable. A number of students started their own art practice at home. The students started taking on more challenging assignments in art, reading and writing, and academic knowledge. I also noticed that they took on more personal and communal responsibilities. To sum up, these are the key points I want you to come away with. Culturally appropriate pedagogy for deaf and hard of hearing students must capitalize on vision. The curriculum content must be fully accessible through vision. Arts-based literacy may provide access to metaphoric language and lead to cognitive flexibility. Involving talented artists is essential to the development of arts-infused curriculum. It's paramount. Arts activities should be integrated into all subject areas, including science, social studies, English, math. Again, this is key. Deaf and hard of hearing students need to be taught in a bilingual environment. Deaf adults need to be invited into the classroom to support the students' learning. They could serve as role models so students know that they too can have a successful future. I can't stress this point enough. In my practice, I also brought in deaf community members as linguistic models, so the students could see other signers and not just rely solely on my language modeling. This too is important.